New York City in the mid-19th century was not the glittering metropolis we know today. It was a dark, suffocating labyrinth of shadows, smoke, and rot. If you walked through the infamous Five Points district, the stench of sewage and poverty would stay with you for days. In this concrete jungle, human life was cheap, but for the children of the streets, it was worth almost nothing. An estimated 30,000 children lived in the gutters of Manhattan. They were known as the street rats. These weren't just orphans. They were the forgotten casualties of a rapidly growing empire. They slept in damp cardboard boxes, huddled together on cold stone steps, or sought warmth over the iron grates of the city's factories. Hunger was their only constant companion. To survive, they sold newspapers for pennies, shined shoes of men who looked right through them, or turned to petty crime just to stay alive for one more night. Disease, like cholera and typhus, swept through the slums, leaving thousands of infants without parents every single year. The police often found small, frozen bodies in the alleyways when the sun came up. The city was drowning in its own misery. It was in this atmosphere of despair that a man named Charles Loring Brace stepped forward. He looked at these thousands of suffering souls and came to a radical, some would say cold-blooded, conclusion. He believed the city was a poison that destroyed a child's character. His solution? To gather them up like unwanted cargo and ship them far away. He wanted to send them to the American West, to the vast prairies where their labor could be useful. This was the birth of the most controversial social experiment in the history of the United States. Thousands of children were about to be loaded into iron wagons, beginning a journey into the unknown that would change the face of America forever. The Great Departure usually began at dawn under the thick, soot-filled skies of the New York railway yards. For many of these children, the sight of a steam locomotive was terrifying, a massive, hissing iron beast that promised to take them away from the only world they had ever known. Before boarding, each child was given a small bag. Inside was a fresh set of clothes, a piece of bread, and a New Testament Bible. They were told they were going to a land of milk and honey, a paradise in the West, where every child would have a mother and a father. But as the heavy iron doors of the rail cars slammed shut and the bolts turned, the dream of paradise felt more like a prison sentence. The journey into the heart of America was grueling. These were not luxury carriages. They were often cramped, poorly ventilated wooden boxes that shook violently as they sped across the tracks. In the sweltering heat of July, the air inside became thick and unbreathable. In the dead of winter, the children huddled together under thin blankets, shivering as the frost crept across the windows. The trip could last anywhere from 5 days to 3 weeks. Their diet was repetitive and meager: crackers, hard cheese, and occasionally a piece of cold meat provided by local charities at station stops. Younger children, some only 3 or 4 years old, sobbed quietly for mothers they barely remembered. The older boys, hardened by the streets of Manhattan, sat in stony silence, watching the endless flat prairies of Illinois and Iowa roll by. For a child who had never seen anything but brick walls and cobblestones, the vast, empty horizons of the American West were not beautiful, they were haunting. To them, the silence of the countryside was deafening. Every time the train's whistle shrieked and the brakes began to grind against the iron rails, a wave of pure panic would wash through the carriage. They knew that at the next station, their lives would be decided by a crowd of strangers waiting on the platform. When the train finally ground to a halt at a dusty station in Missouri or Nebraska, the real nightmare began. This was the moment the children feared most. They were led out of the dark wagons, blinking against the harsh prairie sunlight, and marched onto the wooden platforms, but there were no hugs or warm welcomes waiting for them. Instead, they were told to stand on large wooden crates or station benches so that everyone in the gathering crowd could get a clear view. This was a human market, pure and simple. Local farmers, ranch hands, and businessmen would walk up and down the line, their eyes cold and calculating. They didn't look at these children as human beings in need of a home, they looked at them as livestock. Men would reach out with rough, calloused hands to feel the muscles in a boy's arms or legs. They would force their mouths open to check their teeth for signs of disease or age, exactly as they would when buying a horse or a cow. Is he strong enough to handle a plow? Wrong. Can she work the kitchen for 16 hours a day? These were the only questions that mattered to the buyers. The most heartbreaking scenes occurred when siblings were involved. A farmer might need a strong boy for the fields, but refuse to take his younger sister. The air would be filled with the agonizing screams of brothers and sisters being torn apart, clinging to each other until the adults forced them into separate wagons. Most of them would never see or hear from their siblings again for the rest of their lives. For those not chosen, the journey continued to the next town, their shame and fear growing with every mile of track. For the lucky ones, the orphan train was indeed a miracle. Some children were taken in by kind, childless couples who treated them as their own, providing them with education, love, and a future. History records incredible success stories. 2 boys from these trains eventually grew up to become governors, while others became successful lawyers, doctors, and wealthy merchants. But for thousands of others, the placing out system was nothing more than a thin veil for modern slavery. Once the train pulled away and the agents from the Children's Aid Society left, the child was entirely at the mercy of their new masters. There was almost no supervision. In remote farmhouses, many children were worked to the bone from sunrise to sunset, sleeping in drafty barns and eating nothing but scraps. They were often viewed as cheap labor rather than family members. Abuse was common, and for a child from New York, there was nowhere to run. If they escaped, they were lost in a vast, wild wilderness they didn't understand. Their identities were often systematically erased. Their names were changed, their pasts were forbidden to be spoken of, and their connections to their biological families in the East were severed forever. They became ghosts in their own lives, carrying the heavy trauma of abandonment and the scars of hard labor. The society claimed to be saving souls, but for many of these children, they had simply traded the cold gutters of Manhattan for the lonely, brutal fields of the West. The orphan trains continued to roll across the American landscape for 75 long years, finally coming to an end in 1929 as foster care laws began to change. By the time the last whistle blew, over 250,000 children had been relocated. This massive forced migration remains one of the largest and most mysterious chapters in American history. Today, it is estimated that over 2 million Americans, 1 out of every 25 people, are direct descendants of an orphan train rider. We look back at the faded, sepia-toned photographs of these children, and we see more than just orphans. We see the hidden foundation of a nation. They were the small, tired hands that helped build the American West, survivors of an era that valued progress over compassion. Their stories are a complex mix of hope and horror, of rescue and deep betrayal. The Gilded Archive exists to ensure that these voices are never truly lost. These children were more than just statistics or street rats. They were individuals with dreams that were often crushed by the gears of history. As we close this chapter, we remember their silent journey across the plains. Their secrets remain locked in the shadows of the past, waiting for us to find the keys. Thank you for journeying through history with us. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe to the Gilded Archive and join us as we uncover more truths that time tried to bury.